So it's been a decade since Campfire Audio came out with the original Andromedas. And this is a very original pair with the original hex screws and the original shape shells, which were a little bit edgy for sticking in your ears. And well, if you haven't been around the hobby for as long as I have, you're probably wondering, why are these IEMs such a big deal? I mean, they've only got 5 balanced armatures in them, 2 for the bass, 1 for the mid, 2 for the highs. Everyone's using a whole bunch of different drivers nowadays. Well, back in the day, of 2015, there just weren't so many drivers available. It was basically balanced armature plus dynamics, and that was it. I'd like to thank Campfire Audio and Bloom Audio for sponsoring my channel. Andrew and his team at Bloom Audio have an astounding range of gear, from the inexpensive all the way up to the exotic, including the Campfire Audio range of IEMs, and they aim to have the most outstanding customer service in the industry. Ken Ball of Campfire Audio, and originally ALO Audio, which was his first company, did something which really hit the spot with listeners. Now, the first thing is he tuned these IEMs to sound much like Odyssey's LCD-Xs, which were very popular headphones at the time. This is an original 2013 pair, if you haven't already been watching my channel where I've talked about them. And they have a slightly maybe warm of neutral tuning, and this really hit the spot for a lot of people after the LCD2s. Sort of neutral, a touch warm. If you compare it to some of the brighter headphones that you get nowadays, and especially brighter IEMs, yeah, it's a little bit different. But at the time, this tuning was spot on, and these were some of my favorite, and still are some of my favorite headphones. Now, the other thing Ken did, I'm going to explain with an example from my own experience with IEMs. I bought a pair of Andromedas 55510s, and they were kind of the in thing to have back in the day. And they came with a very generic cable, as did all IEMs at the time. And I've got one of them here. This cable is really old, and you think that looks really green. Yes, that's not a camera color error. It is very green because it's very corroded. It's tin copper, and all IEM cables at the time were this basic tin copper deal. So I had UE10s with a black version of that tin copper cable. And I thought, well, people are talking about aftermarket cables, and I thought, well, I'll give one a go. No judgment. I don't know if it's going to make any difference at all. So I bought one, plugged it into the UE10s, and suddenly a whole lot of harshness in the mid-range and treble had gone. Oh, okay, so there is a difference there. Now remember, we're talking about this in 2026, where even the cheapest IEMs come with a basically good cable. It's a different world, but 2015, yeah, it's very different to now. So Ken put on there a much better cable. By offering a good quality cable versus the crappy ones that were on all IEMs, and tuning it well to a kind of tuning that people wanted, he had an instant hit. It got to the point where for the next couple of years after the Andromedas were originally released, any new IEMs that came out, the first thing people would ask online is, how do they compare to the Andromedas? Now, of course, we've moved quite a bit on from there. Now, Ken never really reproduced the hype he had around the Andromedas. He tried other IEMs. Some were really successful, some were not. And he tried re-releasing the Andromedas with slightly different tunings and slightly different ideas. But with the IEM world so focused on people trying to reproduce the hype around the Andromedas with their own models, with their own unique tunings, the market became just flooded with all sorts of different models with different tunings, and yeah, it was never quite the same. But Ken has produced the 10th anniversary version, and these have, well, 10 drivers versus 5, double what was in the originals. And you can see that the shells are considerably larger and considerably oddly shaped. And if you're wondering, well, the original models, of course, had something of an ear canal shaped driver. This I find left and right. If I stick one in my ears, then you can see it just fits neatly inside the space in front of the ear canal. However, the new model has a really odd shape. Now, normally if you want to put more drivers in, the shell ends up becoming bigger and extending out. Ken has gone for a slightly odd shape, which doesn't quite make sense the first time you grab it, because it's kind of deeper than it is wide. So you end up, when you stick them in your ears, with this result that you have, it sticks like out, but is narrower in the horizontal way, but taller and deeper. But it means you can actually pick them in and out very easily, unlike other IEMs where you're kind of fiddling around. And the first time you pick them up, you're kind of like, oh, which is left and right? What's going on here? And initially it's a little bit confusing, but once you get it, it makes a lot of sense. And it's also the first pair of Andromedas and the first Campfire Audio IEM to use a 2-pin connector. All Campfire Audio IEMs prior to these used the MMCX connector, which the endlessly swiveling one, but he's gone for a 2-pin, which is a bit of a change and probably a welcome one for a lot of people. I have a bit of a suspicion that in the future, I think all IEMs will end up with 2-pin and the MMCX will fade out eventually, but who knows? There are a lot of models out there. I think it's going to take a while. Now, of course, having just balanced armature drivers, it's not going to be as advanced sounding as a lot of stuff that's out there. Some IEMs will have really fantastic treble due to the combination of electric drivers and other setups. Some have really fantastic bass due to really great dynamic drivers. I'm a fan of single dynamic driver IEMs myself. But the one thing that the Campfire Audio Andromeda 10s do is coherency. So, in that, if you're wondering how do they compare to the originals, well, there's a lot better space and delineation versus the originals. That's certainly a given. The other thing, of course, having more drivers is that you have more headroom if you want to turn the sound up. I don't listen loud, and I certainly don't recommend listening loud. But in the overall scheme of things, yeah, they're about as good a pair of IEMs as you're going to get with just balanced armatures in there. For example, whatever music I listen to a whole lot of female vocals. I won't give descriptions of individual music tracks so much in this video review. There'll be some in the written review if you want to see specifics, but generally things like female vocals and percussion like cymbals and the like tended to sound a little bit sibilant because they're only using balanced armature drivers for the treble, and they tend to have a little bit of distortion. So regardless of what I did with ear tips, there was still a little bit of sibilance and tizziness up there. The mid-range too, it wasn't quite as good as maybe you can get with some other things like dynamic driver IEMs. And the bass wasn't quite as sharp and punchy as you can get, say, with the, well, they're now discontinued, say, the A8000 IEMs from Final, which are a single dynamic driver IEM. But the thing is that I've noticed with a lot of IEMs is that sometimes you get bass and you'll get the mid sound different and the treble sounds different, and it doesn't sound like a whole coherent sound stage or sound delivery. The presentation tends to be a bit of this and a bit of that, and it doesn't all quite work. And I noticed that with a lot of IEMs I tried at Can Jams and at the Earphone Festival, the coherency was not so great. With the Andromeda 10s though, the coherency is fantastic. It feels like a single driver is delivering the music like you get in headphones, rather than a whole bunch of drivers assembled together. I think some very high-end IEMs, which are up into like $3,000, $4,000, where things start to really get coherent with different types of drivers. Maybe there are some below that, maybe $2,000. But the Andromedas deliver that for under $2,000, something which I haven't heard. Sure, something like a Moondrop Meteor is going to have better treble. Something like, well, pick a good dynamic driver IEM is going to have better bass. Mid-range, yeah, well, there's a whole lot of discussion there. But it just doesn't sound coherent. The Andromeda 10s do. So for example, one of the factors of that is you can tune these to a degree like the originals through tip selection. And if you've been observant so far, you'll see I have Elitech Baroque stage tips on there. When I was just doing my reevaluation before shooting this video, I put these on there, and after going through a bunch of ear tips. The stock silicon ear tips, of where you have the black silicon and you have the clear silicon, they don't mask the sibilance as much as can be done with aftermarket ear tips, such as I like the JVC spiral dot tips, of which they now have the FX12, which has a new design. They have a spiral of dots literally inside the nozzle, which reduces internal reflections, and that helps clean up the mid-range and treble nicely. And they also bring out the bass very nicely. So you end up getting a warm, full sound with fairly punchy and good bass. Again, albeit not as great as a dynamic driver IEM, but still very good. Elitech Baroque tips do a similar job, but the Baroque stage, which I have on here at the moment, do reduce the bass down a bit. And so I found that I could tune the amount of bass I wanted in there depending on my preferences. Now, with a track, for example, that I really like, El Chicano's Viva Tirado, that is a very busy track with a lot going on. It can sound very punchy, and especially depending on the ear tips you select. However, things do kind of get busy and you don't get quite the delineation you get out of higher end IEMs where you can hear more precisely where the instruments are. Just the music is very coherent, but it's also all one piece, one big presentation of sound coming at your ears. And maybe while the percussion and similarly vocals on other tracks are still a little bit sibilant, still not quite as perfect. For a lot of the time, I found myself, if I had to pick up IEMs and listen, I could pick up the Andromedas, and I knew that I'd get a coherent result out of them. Whereas with other IEMs, it tended to be a bit hit and miss depending on the music I was using, whether I enjoyed them or not. So that makes the Andromedas what they all were really good at, much like the similarly tuned headphones from Odyssey, the LCDXs, is it makes them a really good all-round pair of IEMs that gives you a good overall and coherent presentation of all kinds of music, whether I'm listening to classical or pop or rock or what have you. It meant that I knew I can enjoy listening to music from them, which is not always possible with some IEMs that have more radical tuning, say the more V-shaped FX17s I reviewed, or some others which are very bright and sharp and maybe too much for pop music. I can always subtly tune the bass through choosing ear tips, but I know I'll always get a good listen, if not one that I can maybe as great as something I can get for maybe a few $1,000s more. Now, originally the price of the Andromedas was $1,200 US, and Ken refused to go down the road of making $2,000 IEMs at the time, remember, and this is, again, over a decade ago. Now, of course, with inflation and with increasing price costs, it's probably more than inflation would make $1,200 these days. So you're getting up towards $1,700, $1,800 for a pair of Andromeda 10s. But if you want to guarantee that you can listen to any kind of music, then they do a really fantastic job. What is more, they do scale very well with the kind of equipment you use with them. I've used the Muse M6 Double with them a lot, which is a really great IEM DAC amp, which you get a little bit of tube flavor to as well. Something like a Mojo 2 will be fantastic. I've used them even out of the Core TT2 and M scaler, which shows how far up they can level up in terms of sound quality. I was using FIO's M33R2R DAP, and I was using the Andromedas to test between the DAP itself and the DAP feeding an old Sound Potion monolith from Japan. And I could very much make out how much the Sound Potion monolith elevated the sound out of the M33 with the Andromeda 10s. On the other end of the scale, of course, you have the included USB cable DAC, which plugs in instead of the 3.5mm or 4.4mm plugs. This uses a generic Cirrus Logic DAC, as all the cable DACs you tend to get do. And of course, it's not going to be quite as resolving as something like a good dongle DAC or a good player, but actually does do quite well in delivering even punchy music for casual listening if you're using it, say, straight out of a phone. It actually could deliver the bass from various tracks from Bonobo quite well, even if I wasn't hearing as much resolution out of some of the more refined music I listen to. That definitely makes it good for more casual listening, even if it won't get as much out of the Andromedas as you can get out of a good player or a good dongle DAC. So that's the Andromeda 10s. If you have a pair, leave a comment below, not just for my sake, for other people watching and looking whether to buy a pair or not, and let me know how well they went. And also thank you to Bloom Audio and Campfire Audio for sponsoring my channel. Lastly, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to chatting with you online or at a Can Jam.